The coffee cup shattered against the kitchen wall, sending ceramic shards across the worn wooden floor as Peter Adams stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered hands trembling at his sides. The woman at his stove, Jacqueline Clark, didn't flinch at the sound. Instead, she continued stirring the eggs in the cast iron pan, her voice rising in a haunting melody that seemed to fill every corner of the isolated ranch house with something he hadn't felt in 3 years: hope. The morning light streaming through the single window caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair as she sang, and Peter found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to reconcile the broken shell of a woman who had arrived at his door 6 weeks ago with this creature of grace and music who had somehow transformed his kitchen into something that felt dangerously close to home. He had hired her for one reason only: to cook his meals and leave him alone. Nothing more. The advertisement in the Gazette had been specific. Isolated rancher seeks cook. Room and board provided. Discretion required. No conversation necessary. He had received only 3 responses, and Jacqueline's letter had been the briefest, stating simply that she could cook and needed work. When she arrived on that cold October morning, stepping down from Tyler Foster's wagon with nothing but a small carpet bag and eyes that held the same hollow emptiness he saw in his own mirror, he knew she would suit his purposes perfectly. But now, watching her move with quiet confidence around his kitchen, listening to her voice weave melodies that seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart until it ached, Peter realized he had made a terrible miscalculation. She was supposed to be invisible, a necessity like the hired hands who worked his cattle and spoke only when spoken to. She was supposed to prepare his meals and retreat to her small room above the kitchen, leaving him to his solitude and his guilt. Instead, she had begun to sing. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story of how Peter Adams found himself standing in his kitchen, watching his world crack open like that shattered coffee cup, begins 6 weeks earlier on a morning when the October wind carried the first promise of winter across the Montana Territory. Peter had been alone on the Broken Arrow Ranch for 3 years, ever since the fever took his wife, Sarah, and their infant son. The ranch hands, Kevin Parker and Larry Wright, lived in the bunkhouse and knew better than to linger around the main house after their work was done. They had watched their boss transform from a man who once laughed easily and welcomed neighbors to Sunday dinner into something harder and more remote than the mountains that ringed his property. The isolation suited Peter. It matched the landscape inside him, barren and unforgiving. He rose before dawn, worked until exhaustion claimed him, and fell into dreamless sleep in the bed he had once shared with Sarah. He ate cold beans from cans and stale bread when hunger forced him to remember his body's needs. The house that had once been filled with Sarah's laughter and the promise of children grew thick with dust and silence. But even a man determined to fade away must eat, and when Kevin Parker mentioned that his wife Carol had heard Peter was looking poorly, the suggestion of hiring help became less a luxury than a necessity. The advertisement he placed was deliberately unwelcoming. He wanted someone who would understand that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. Jacqueline Clark arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost painted the grass silver and the air held the sharp bite of approaching winter. Tyler Foster's wagon creaked to a stop in front of the ranch house, and Peter watched from his kitchen window as a woman in a dark gray dress climbed down with careful, measured movements. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled severely back and a face that might have been beautiful if not for the careful blankness she wore like armor. Tyler helped her down with her single bag, tipped his hat, and drove away without the usual pleasantries he exchanged with Peter. Later, Peter would wonder what Tyler had seen in Jacqueline's face that made him handle her with such gentle courtesy, as if she were made of something fragile that might shatter at the wrong word. She knocked on his door with 3 precise raps and waited. When Peter opened it, she met his eyes for exactly 1 second before looking past his shoulder into the house. "I'm here about the cooking position," she said. Her voice was low and carefully controlled, with the faintest trace of an accent he couldn't place. "You're Jacqueline Clark." Yes. He had expected questions about wages, about her duties, about the isolation. Instead, she waited in perfect stillness for him to decide her fate. Something in that patience, in the way she held herself as if she had learned to expect nothing, made him step aside and gesture her into the house. "Rooms upstairs," he said. "Meals at sunrise, noon, and sunset. I'll be working most days until dark. Kevin Parker and Larry Wright eat with the hands in the bunkhouse." She nodded once and followed him through the front room, past the cold fireplace and the furniture draped in dust sheets, to the kitchen at the back of the house. Peter watched her take in the space with quick, assessing glances. The wood stove that needed blackening, the pump that sometimes stuck, the shelves lined with canned goods and sacks of flour and beans. "There's a root cellar," he said, opening the door to show her the stairs leading down into darkness. "Potatoes, onions, some preserved meat, chickens out back for eggs. And the supplies in town? Once a month. Make a list." She set her bag on the scarred wooden table and untied her bonnet with efficient movements. Underneath, her dark hair was streaked with premature silver at the temples, and Peter found himself wondering what had put those lines around her eyes. What had taught her to move through the world with such careful economy? "I'll start with supper," she said. That first evening, Peter sat at his kitchen table and ate the best meal he'd had in 3 years. Beef stew thick with vegetables from his own garden, bread that steamed when he broke it open, coffee strong enough to chase away the October chill. Jacqueline served him in silence and retreated to her room while he ate, appearing only to clear his dishes when he finished. For 2 weeks, this became their routine. She prepared his meals with quiet efficiency, kept the kitchen spotless, and asked for nothing beyond what was necessary for her work. She spoke only when spoken to, and then only the minimum required. Peter told himself this was exactly what he wanted. A cook who understood boundaries, who wouldn't try to fill his house with unwanted chatter or sympathy. But sometimes when he came in from the range at midday, he would catch her standing at the kitchen window, looking out toward the mountains with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made something twist in his chest. She would sense his presence and turn away, busying herself with preparations for his meal. But the image would linger in his mind as he ate in silence. It was during the 3rd week that he first heard her humming. He had come in earlier than usual, hoping to catch a few minutes by the fire before the evening chores. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see Jacqueline kneading bread dough with steady rhythmic motions. Under her breath, so quietly he almost missed it, she was humming a melody he didn't recognize, something sad and beautiful that seemed to come from some deep well of memory. Peter stood frozen in the hallway, afraid to move and break the spell. He had not heard music in his house since Sarah died. He had put away her piano, unable to bear the reminder of evenings when she would play while he read by lamplight, their son sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. But this was different. This was not Sarah's bright, trained voice or her practiced fingers on the keys. This was something raw, more elemental, a sound that spoke of loss and endurance, of beauty carved out of hardship. When Jacqueline finished the bread and moved to the stove, the humming stopped. Peter retreated to his study, but the melody stayed with him through the evening, weaving through his thoughts like smoke. The next morning he lingered over his coffee, hoping to hear it again. But Jacqueline moved through her morning routine in perfect silence, her face composed and distant. Peter began to wonder if he had imagined it, if his isolation had finally driven him to hearing things that weren't there. Then 3 days later, it happened again. This time he was in the barn, grooming his horse when the sound drifted across the yard. A different melody, equally haunting, carried on the morning air. He left the barn and moved closer to the house, following the sound like a man following a siren's call. Through the kitchen window he could see Jacqueline standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. Her head was tilted slightly, and her lips moved with words he couldn't hear. But the melody was clear, rising and falling with the rhythm of her stirring, as if cooking and singing were part of the same ancient ritual. Peter found himself thinking about her at odd moments throughout the day. Not in the way a man thinks about a woman, but in the way a person thinks about a puzzle that refuses to be solved. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had brought her to his isolated ranch, willing to work for a man who barely acknowledged her existence? He began to notice small things, the way she arranged wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table, as if beauty were something that couldn't be entirely abandoned. The careful mending she did on her few dresses, invisible stitches that spoke of pride maintained against difficult circumstances. The fact that she never ate until after he had finished, as if she believed herself unworthy of sharing the meal she had prepared. One evening, as she served his supper, Peter found himself studying her hands. They were small and graceful, but marked with old scars and calluses that spoke of harder work than cooking. When she reached across the table to set down his plate, he caught a glimpse of a faded bruise on her wrist, mostly healed but still visible as a yellow shadow against her pale skin. "Where did you come from?" he asked suddenly. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a doused fire. Jacqueline's hand stilled on the serving spoon, and for a moment Peter thought she wouldn't answer. "East," she said finally. "That's not much of an answer." She met his eyes then, and he saw something flash there before she looked away. "It's all the answer I have to give." The rebuke was gentle but firm, and Peter felt heat rise in his cheeks. He had no right to pry into her past. No more than she had the right to ask about Sarah or the son whose grave he visited every Sunday after church. They had made an unspoken agreement, her labor for his money, her silence for his solitude. It was not his place to ask for more, but the questions remained, growing stronger each time he heard her sing. It was Joshua Roberts, the circuit preacher who stopped by once a month, who gave Peter the first real clue about his mysterious cook. Joshua arrived on a cold November morning, his horse steaming in the frosty air, and accepted Peter's grudging invitation to warm himself by the fire. "Heard you hired some help," Joshua said, settling into the chair across from Peter with a cup of Jacqueline's coffee warming his hands. "Word travels fast. Carol Parker mentioned it to Judith Cook, who told Amy Hill. You know how it is." Peter did know. In a territory where neighbors might be separated by 20 miles of rough country, news was precious currency. The fact that the solitary Peter Adams had hired a woman to cook for him would be discussed and dissected in every kitchen from here to Billings. "She's a good cook," Peter said, hoping to end the conversation. But Joshua was studying him with the sharp eyes that had made him effective at reading souls as well as scripture. "Tyler Foster said she came in on the stage from back east. Had that look about her," he said, "like she was running from something. That's her business. Maybe. But in my experience, people don't end up in places like this unless they're running towards something or away from it. And the ones running away usually need help, whether they ask for it or not." Before Peter could respond, Jacqueline appeared in the doorway with a plate of fresh biscuits and honey. She moved with the same quiet efficiency she always displayed, but Peter noticed the way her shoulders tensed when Joshua smiled at her, the way she kept her eyes downcast as she served them. "Ma'am," Joshua said with the warm courtesy he extended to all women, regardless of their station. "I'm Joshua Roberts. I appreciate the hospitality." "Jacqueline Clark," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're new to our territory. How are you finding it?" It was a simple question, the kind any neighbor might ask. But Jacqueline's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the plate, and she took a small step backward, as if preparing to flee. "It's fine," she said quickly. "Excuse me." She disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Joshua and Peter in uncomfortable silence. After a moment, Joshua set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "Peter," he said quietly, "I've seen that look before. In women who've had reason to be afraid of men asking questions." The words hit Peter like a physical blow. He thought of the faded bruise on Jacqueline's wrist, the way she flinched sometimes when he moved too quickly, the careful distance she maintained between herself and any situation that might require her to reveal something personal. How had he been so blind? "You think someone hurt her?" "I think someone hurt her badly enough that she's willing to live in isolation with a stranger rather than risk staying wherever she came from." Joshua's voice was gentle but firm. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing. It's not my concern." But even as he said the words, Peter knew they weren't true. Somewhere over the past month, Jacqueline Clark had become his concern, whether he wanted her to be or not. Not because of any romantic attachment, but because she had brought something back into his house that he thought had died with Sarah. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that life could be more than mere survival. After Joshua left, Peter found himself watching Jacqueline more carefully. He began to notice things he had missed before. The way she always positioned herself near an exit, the way she startled at sudden noises, the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever anyone other than Peter was around. Even Kevin and Larry, who were as gentle as men came, seemed to make her nervous. But it was her singing that revealed the most about her hidden depths. As the days grew shorter and the Montana winter tightened its grip on the land, Jacqueline's melodies became more frequent, more complex. She sang while she kneaded bread, while she stirred soup, while she swept the kitchen floor, always quietly as if the music was meant for her alone, but with a richness and beauty that suggested years of training. One evening, as Peter sat by the fire reading, he heard her voice rise in a song he recognized. It was an old hymn, one Sarah used to play on Sundays, but Jacqueline's version was different, slower, more mournful, as if she had taken the hopeful words about redemption and grace and filtered them through her own experience of loss and longing. Without thinking, Peter rose and moved toward the kitchen. The door was open, and he could see Jacqueline standing at the sink, washing dishes by lamplight. Her voice filled the small space, transforming the mundane task into something that felt almost sacred. She must have sensed his presence because she stopped singing abruptly and turned. For a moment they looked at each other across the threshold, and Peter saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Vulnerability, yes, but also a fierce kind of beauty, as if her music had stripped away the careful mask she wore and revealed the woman underneath. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." The words came out rougher than he intended. "You have a beautiful voice." Color rose in her cheeks, and she turned back to the dishes. "It's nothing. Just something to pass the time." But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. Her singing was the most honest thing about her, the one part of herself she couldn't completely hide. In those melodies, Peter heard stories of love and loss, of dreams deferred and hope maintained against impossible odds. He heard the echo of his own grief, transformed into something that was still painful, but no longer entirely hopeless. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Peter didn't dream of Sarah and their son. Instead, he dreamed of music filling his empty house, of a woman's voice calling him back from the edge of a darkness he hadn't even realized he was approaching. The next morning, he woke to the sound of singing drifting up from the kitchen below. Jacqueline was making breakfast, her voice weaving through the familiar sounds of bacon sizzling and coffee percolating. Peter lay in bed for a few extra minutes, letting the music wash over him, and realized that something fundamental had shifted in the careful balance they had maintained. He was no longer content to simply coexist with Jacqueline Clark. He wanted to know her story, to understand what had brought her to his door and what kept her awake at night when she thought no one could hear her moving restlessly in the room above his kitchen. He wanted to tell her that her music was healing something in him that he thought was permanently broken. But most of all, he wanted to protect her from whatever she was running from, even if he didn't yet know what that might be. As if summoned by his thoughts, Jacqueline's voice rose in a new melody, one he had never heard before. It was different from her usual songs, lighter somehow, with notes that climbed towards something that might have been joy. Peter closed his eyes and listened, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that might hold more than just survival. He had no way of knowing that downstairs Jacqueline was thinking similar thoughts as she watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. For 6 weeks she had lived in careful isolation, grateful for the work and shelter, but determined to remain invisible, untouchable. She had learned the hard way that letting people too close led to pain and betrayal. But Peter Adams was different from any man she had ever known. He asked for nothing beyond what they had agreed upon, respected her boundaries without question, and never made her feel like his charity case or his possession. In his quiet presence, she had begun to feel something she thought was lost forever: safety. The singing had started almost without her realizing it, at first just humming to fill the silence while she worked. Then fragments of melodies from her childhood, songs her mother had taught her before the world turned hard and complicated. Finally, the hymns and folk songs that had sustained her through the worst times, when music was the only thing that kept her from disappearing entirely. She hadn't meant for Peter to hear her, but she was glad he had. His reaction, the way his face had softened when he told her she had a beautiful voice, made her feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with fear or judgment. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and seen something worth preserving. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. As November gave way to December, the dynamic between them began to shift in subtle ways. Peter started lingering over his meals, not talking exactly, but creating space for conversation if she wanted to fill it. Jacqueline found herself taking more care with her appearance, pinning wildflowers in her hair, and wearing the one dress that wasn't entirely practical. The change was so gradual that neither of them acknowledged it directly, but it was there in the way Peter's eyes followed her movements around the kitchen, in the way Jacqueline's singing grew bolder and more frequent, in the small courtesies they began to extend to each other. Peter started bringing in extra firewood without being asked, stacking it neatly by the kitchen stove. Jacqueline began preparing his favorite meals without prompting, somehow intuiting his preferences from his quiet appreciation. When a winter storm kept them both housebound for 3 days, they fell into an easy rhythm of shared domestic tasks, working around each other with a familiarity that felt both new and ancient. It was during that storm that Jacqueline finally began to tell her story. She started with small details offered casually while they worked together to prepare meals or tend the fire. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a music teacher and a seamstress. She had been married once, to a man who seemed kind until the wedding ring was on her finger. She had worked as a governess, a seamstress, a dozen other jobs that barely paid enough to keep body and soul together. Peter listened without judgment, offering his own fragments in return. He told her about Sarah, about the son who had lived only 6 months, about the way grief had hollowed him out until he forgot how to be human. He spoke of the ranch, of the satisfaction he found in working with his hands, and the way the vast Montana sky made him feel both insignificant and infinite. They were careful with each other, trading confidences like precious coins, never pushing for more than the other was willing to give. But gradually a picture emerged of two people who had been broken by life in different ways and were slowly, cautiously learning to trust again. The turning point came on Christmas Eve. Peter had never been one for celebrations, and since Sarah's death, he had treated December 24th like any other day. But when he came in from the evening chores, he found the kitchen transformed. Jacqueline had made paper flowers from old newspapers and strung them along the window frames. Candles flickered on every surface, filling the room with warm, dancing light. The table was set with his grandmother's good china, which he hadn't seen in years, and the smell of roasting chicken filled the air. "What's all this?" he asked, though his tone held wonder rather than disapproval. "Christmas," Jacqueline said simply. She was wearing her best dress, the blue one that brought out the color in her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a soft style that made her look younger, less guarded. I hoped you wouldn't mind." Peter looked around the transformed kitchen and felt something crack open in his chest. This was what his house had been like when Sarah was alive, full of light and warmth and the kind of beauty that came from someone caring enough to make an effort. He had forgotten what it felt like to come home to something more than mere shelter. "It's beautiful," he said, and his voice came out rough with emotion. They ate by candlelight, and for the first time since she had arrived, Jacqueline sat across from him at the table instead of serving him and retreating. The conversation flowed more easily than it ever had, touching on books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had once held. Peter found himself laughing at something she said, a sound so rusty from disuse that it startled them both. After dinner, Jacqueline disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I made this for you," she said, setting it beside his plate, with hands that trembled slightly. "It's not much, but I wanted to give you something." Peter unwrapped the package carefully and found a pair of wool socks, knitted in a complex pattern that must have taken hours to complete. The wool was soft and expertly dyed a deep blue, and the stitches were so fine, and even they looked like machine work. "Jacqueline," he breathed, "these are beautiful, but I don't have anything for you." "You gave me a home when I needed one," she said quietly. "You gave me work and respect and the chance to feel useful again. That's more than enough. Peter looked at the woman across from him, really looked at her, and saw not the broken creature who had arrived at his door 2 months ago, but someone who had been slowly healing in the safety he had unknowingly provided. Her face had filled out slightly, losing the gaunt look of someone who had known real hunger. Her eyes, while still cautious, held warmth now instead of the flat emptiness he remembered from that first day. "There's something I want to give you," he said suddenly. "Wait here." He left the kitchen and climbed the stairs to the room that had been Sarah's music room. The room he had kept locked since her death. His hands shook as he turned the key and pushed open the door. Dust motes danced in the candlelight from the kitchen below, and the piano sat shrouded in white cloth like a ghost of better times. But it wasn't the piano he had come for. In the corner, wrapped in an old quilt, was Sarah's guitar. She had played it sometimes in the evenings. Simpler songs than the complex pieces she performed on the piano. Folk songs and ballads that she sang in her clear, sweet voice while Peter read or worked on ranch accounts. He carried the guitar downstairs and found Jacqueline still sitting at the table, her eyes wide with curiosity and something that might have been hope. "This was my wife's," he said, setting the instrument carefully on the table between them. "She would have wanted someone to play it again." Jacqueline's hands flew to her throat and tears spilled over her cheeks. "Peter, I can't. It's too precious." "Music is meant to be shared," he said, echoing words Sarah had spoken to him years ago. "Please, I want to hear you play." With trembling fingers, Jacqueline lifted the guitar and cradled it against her body. She tested the strings, making small adjustments to the tuning, and Peter could see muscle memory taking over as her hands found their positions. When she began to play, the melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a song he didn't recognize but that seemed to speak directly to his soul. Then she began to sing, and Peter understood that everything he had heard before had been just a whisper compared to this. Her voice soared and dipped with the guitar's accompaniment, telling a story of love and loss, of journeys taken and homes found. It was a song about redemption, about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. When the last note faded into silence, Peter found that his own cheeks were wet with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. "My mother taught me the basics, but mostly I taught myself. Music was—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Music was the only thing that stayed mine, no matter what else was taken away." The simple statement held volumes of pain, and Peter felt a surge of protective anger toward whoever had hurt this remarkable woman. But he pushed the emotion aside, focusing instead on the gift she had given him. For the first time in 3 years, his house felt alive again. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the guitar resting in Jacqueline's lap like a sleeping cat. The candles had burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the winter wind rattled the windows with a sound that no longer seemed lonely. "Will you play another?" Peter asked finally. She smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he had seen from her, and began a new song. This one was lighter, a melody that spoke of spring and new beginnings, of hope carefully nurtured back to life. As she played, Peter allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to hear this music every evening, to come home to light and warmth and the sound of someone singing because they were happy, not just because they were trying to fill an empty space. The thought should have frightened him. For 3 years, he had built his life around the certainty that love was too dangerous, too painful to risk again. But sitting in his transformed kitchen, listening to Jacqueline breathe life back into Sarah's guitar, he found that the fear was smaller than it used to be, overwhelmed by something that felt suspiciously like hope. When she finished the second song, Jacqueline set the guitar carefully aside and began to clear the dinner dishes. Peter watched her move around the kitchen with easy familiarity and realized that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being his employee and become something much more complicated. "Jacqueline," he said, and she turned to look at him with questioning eyes. "Thank you. For tonight, for the music, for—" He gestured helplessly around the transformed kitchen. "For making this feel like home again." She smiled again, softer this time, but no less genuine. "Thank you for letting me stay, for giving me a place to heal." The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of what they had both been avoiding. This was no longer a simple business arrangement between employer and employee. They had become something to each other, something that didn't have an easy name but felt as necessary as breathing. As if by mutual agreement, they worked together to clean up from dinner, moving around each other with the practiced ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms. When the last dish was dried and put away, Jacqueline picked up the guitar again. "One more," she asked, and Peter nodded. This time she played a lullaby, something soft and gentle that made him think of Sarah singing their son to sleep. But instead of the sharp pain he expected, Peter felt only a bittersweet tenderness, as if the memory had been wrapped in something soft that made it bearable. When the song ended, Jacqueline rose and carefully placed the guitar in the corner where it would be safe. "Merry Christmas, Peter," she said quietly. "Merry Christmas. Jacqueline?" She started toward the stairs that led to her room, then paused and looked back at him. "The music," she said. "It feels different now, like it means something again." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Peter alone in the kitchen with the lingering scent of candle wax and the echo of her voice in his ears. He sat for a long time in the dying light, thinking about the woman who had come to him, broken and afraid, and was slowly, carefully, teaching him how to live again. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white and muffling all sound, except the whisper of wind through the eaves. Peter finally rose and banked the fire, but he could still hear Jacqueline moving quietly in her room above, and the sound was no longer lonely. It was companionship, the comfortable knowledge that he was not alone in the world. That night he dreamed of music. The next few weeks passed in a haze of quiet contentment that Peter had never expected to feel again. The guitar became a regular presence in their evening routine, and Jacqueline's confidence as a musician grew with each performance. She played everything from classical pieces that showcased her technical skill to folk songs that told stories of ordinary people living extraordinary lives. Peter found himself looking forward to these evening concerts with an anticipation that surprised him. He would finish his chores quickly, sometimes skipping his usual evening inspection of the ranch buildings just so he could get back to the house sooner. Kevin and Larry noticed the change in him, though they were too tactful to comment directly. "Boss seems different lately," Kevin mentioned to Larry one evening as they sat by the bunkhouse stove. "Lighter somehow." "That woman's cooking will do that to a man," Larry replied. But they both knew it was more than just the food. Peter was changing, becoming more like the man he had been before grief hollowed him out. He smiled more, spoke more easily with the hands, and seemed to have regained some interest in the future of the ranch. He talked about improvements he wanted to make come spring, about possibly expanding the herd or trying new grazing areas in the high meadows. But it was the way he looked at Jacqueline that told the real story. Not with the desperate hunger of a man starved for female companionship, but with the careful attention of someone learning to care again despite himself. He noticed when she was tired, when something had made her sad, when she was particularly pleased with a meal she had prepared. He began to anticipate her needs, bringing in extra water when he saw her preparing to do laundry, stacking wood higher when a storm was coming. For her part, Jacqueline was blooming like a flower finally given enough sunlight. The haunted look in her eyes was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like happiness. She laughed more often, sang more freely, and began to take small liberties that spoke of growing comfort with her place in Peter's life. She rearranged the kitchen to suit her preferences, adding feminine touches that made the space feel warmer. She mended his shirts without being asked, taking pride in making the repairs invisible. She began to venture outside more often, exploring the area around the ranch house and even visiting the chickens that had previously been just a source of eggs. The change in both of them was so gradual that neither fully acknowledged it. But it was there in every interaction, every shared glance, every moment of comfortable silence. They were falling in love, though neither would have used those words to describe what was happening. It was Amy Hill who brought the outside world crashing back into their carefully constructed peace. She arrived on a cold February morning, driving her own wagon with the determined efficiency that had made her one of the most respected women in the territory. Amy ran the boarding house in town and knew everyone's business, often before they knew it themselves. Her visit to the Broken Arrow Ranch was unprecedented and, Peter realized as he watched her climb down from her wagon, probably not entirely social. "Peter Adams," she called out as he emerged from the barn. "I need to speak with you." There was something in her tone that made Peter's stomach clench with foreboding. Amy Hill was not given to drama, but her face was grim as she approached the house. "What's this about, Amy?" "It's about your cook, about Jacqueline Clark, if that's even her real name." Peter felt the world tilt slightly, the way it had the day the doctor told him there was nothing more they could do for Sarah and the baby. "What do you mean?" "I mean there's a man in town asking questions about her, a man with a badge and a very unpleasant attitude. He's been showing her picture around, asking if anyone's seen her." The blood drained from Peter's face. "What kind of badge?" "Deputy Marshal from back east. Says she's wanted for questioning in connection with a theft. Says she ran off with something that belongs to her former employer." Peter's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He thought of Jacqueline's reaction to Joshua Roberts, the way she flinched at unexpected questions, the faded bruises he had glimpsed on her wrists. Whatever she had taken, he was willing to bet she had good reason. "Where is he now?" "At my place asking more questions. But Peter, you need to know something else. He's not just any deputy. His name is Tyler Foster." The name hit Peter like a physical blow. Tyler Foster, the man who had brought Jacqueline to the ranch, who had handled her with such careful courtesy. But that had been months ago. And the Tyler Foster Amy was describing sounded like a different person entirely. "That doesn't make sense. Tyler brought her here. He knew where she was." Amy shook her head grimly. "This isn't the same Tyler Foster. This one's got the same name, but he's older, harder, and he's got a mean look about him that makes my skin crawl." Peter's mind raced, trying to make sense of what Amy was telling him. Two men with the same name, one who had helped Jacqueline and one who was hunting her. It seemed impossible, but then he remembered the way Jacqueline had reacted when Tyler Foster's wagon had pulled away that first day. She had watched until it disappeared over the horizon, her face pale with what he had assumed was nervousness about her new situation. Now he realized it might have been relief. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "Not much. He's planning to ride out here this afternoon. Peter, if she's done something wrong—" "She hasn't." The words came out with absolute certainty. "Whatever this is about, Jacqueline isn't a thief." Amy studied his face with the shrewd eyes that had made her successful in a business where reading people was essential for survival. "You care about her." It wasn't a question, and Peter didn't bother to deny it. "Yes." "Then you'd better figure out what you're going to do, because that man isn't going to be satisfied with just asking questions. He's got the look of someone who's been hunting for a long time and doesn't plan to go home empty-handed." After Amy left, Peter stood in his yard for a long moment, trying to decide how to handle the situation. His first instinct was to protect Jacqueline, to send her away before the deputy arrived. But where could she go? And what if running only made her look more guilty? His second instinct was to confront the problem head-on, to demand answers from both Jacqueline and the deputy marshal. But that might force Jacqueline to reveal things she wasn't ready to share, secrets that she had clearly been trying to escape. In the end, he decided on honesty. Jacqueline deserved to know what was coming, and she deserved the chance to make her own choice about how to face it. He found her in the kitchen preparing lunch with the same careful attention she brought to every task. She was humming softly, one of the melodies that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and the sight of her contentment made his chest ache with protective fury. "Jacqueline," he said, and something in his voice made her turn immediately, her face already clouding with concern. "What's wrong?" "There's a man coming, a deputy marshal. He's looking for you." The color drained from her face so quickly that Peter stepped forward, afraid she might faint. But Jacqueline was stronger than she looked. She gripped the edge of the table and held herself upright, though he could see her hands trembling. "What's his name?" she whispered. "Tyler Foster." The name hit her like a physical blow. She made a small, wounded sound and sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her face buried in her hands. "He found me," she said, her voice muffled and broken. "I knew he would eventually, but I thought maybe I had enough time to—" "To what?" She looked up at him then. And Peter saw the woman who had arrived at his door months ago, hollow-eyed and desperate. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't been there before. Strength, maybe, or at least the memory of what strength felt like. To become someone new, she said simply, to leave the past behind and start over. Peter pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, close enough that he could take her hands if she would let him. Tell me what happened, all of it. For a moment he thought she would refuse. Then, as if a dam had burst inside her, the words came pouring out. She had been married to a man named Richard Foster, Tyler's younger brother. Richard had seemed kind during their courtship, but marriage had revealed his true nature. He was controlling, possessive, and increasingly violent when he didn't get his way. For 2 years, Jacqueline had endured his abuse, too ashamed and afraid to ask for help. The breaking point had come when Richard decided they needed money and began pressuring Jacqueline to use her musical talents in ways that made her sick to think about. He wanted her to perform in saloons and dance halls, to use her beauty and voice to attract men who would spend freely on drinks and gambling. When she refused, he beat her so badly that she couldn't leave the house for a week. That was when she discovered that Richard had been stealing from his employer, a wealthy merchant who trusted him to manage his accounts. Richard had been skimming money for months, and when the theft was discovered, he had blamed Jacqueline, claiming she had seduced him into it. I had two choices, Jacqueline said, her voice steady now that the worst of the story was out. Stay and let him destroy me completely, or run and hope I could disappear before Tyler caught up with me. So you took the merchant's money. I took what Richard had stolen and hidden in our house, money that belonged to Mr. Whitmore, money that Richard was going to use to run away and leave me to face the consequences alone. I thought if I could get far enough away, I could send it back somehow, make things right. Peter felt a surge of admiration for the woman beside him. She had been trapped in an impossible situation and had chosen the only path that offered any hope of survival, even knowing it would make her look guilty. Where's the money now? Hidden. I've been saving every penny you've paid me, planning to add it to what I took and send it all back to Mr. Whitmore. I just needed a little more time. How much time? I don't know. I've been afraid to contact anyone back east, afraid that any letter might be traced back here. But I can't keep his money forever. It's not right. Peter looked at this woman who had risked everything to escape an intolerable situation, who had been planning all along to make restitution for a crime she hadn't committed, and felt his heart break a little more. She was braver and more honorable than she knew, and the thought of Tyler Foster dragging her back to face charges for her husband's crimes filled him with rage. We'll figure this out, he said firmly. Together. Jacqueline looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and disbelief. Peter, you don't understand. If Tyler finds me, he'll take me back. And even if I can prove that Richard was the real thief, I'll still be guilty of taking the money. I'll go to prison, or worse. Not if I have anything to say about it. The words came out with such conviction that Jacqueline stared at him. In that moment, Peter realized that his feelings for this woman had gone far beyond simple attraction or even love. She had become essential to him, as necessary as air or water. The thought of losing her was unbearable. What are you saying? I'm saying that Tyler Foster is going to have to go through me to get to you. And I'm saying that we're going to find a way to make this right, to clear your name and give you the fresh start you deserve. Before Jacqueline could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. Peter rose and moved to the window, his heart sinking as he saw a man dismounting from a tired-looking horse. The newcomer was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. But it was his eyes that made Peter's skin crawl, cold and calculating as they surveyed the ranch buildings. He's here, Peter said quietly. Jacqueline rose on unsteady legs and moved to stand beside him at the window. When she saw Tyler Foster, she made a small sound of recognition and fear. That's him. That's Richard's brother. Peter studied the man who had been hunting Jacqueline across half the country. There was a family resemblance to the Tyler Foster who had brought her to the ranch. But this man was older, harder, with the kind of mean look that Amy Hill had described. He moved with the confidence of someone who was used to getting his way. And the badge pinned to his vest caught the afternoon light like a threat. Stay here, Peter said, but Jacqueline shook her head. No, I won't hide behind you. If he's come for me, then I'll face him. Jacqueline, Peter, please, I've been running for months and I'm tired of being afraid. Whatever happens, I want to meet it standing up. There was something in her voice that reminded Peter of the woman who had sung Christmas carols by candlelight, who had breathed life back into his empty house with nothing but her voice and her courage. This was the real Jacqueline Clark, not the broken creature who had arrived at his door, but the strong, determined woman she had always been underneath the fear. All right, he said, but we do this together. They walked out to meet Tyler Foster side by side, and Peter felt a fierce pride in the way Jacqueline held herself straight and tall, despite the fear he knew she was feeling. Whatever happened next, she would face it with dignity. Tyler Foster looked up as they approached, and his cold eyes fixed immediately on Jacqueline. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who enjoyed having power over others. If it isn't my dear sister-in-law, you've led me quite a chase, Jackie. My name is Jacqueline, she said quietly, and Peter heard the steel in her voice. Your name is whatever I say it is, since you're coming back with me to face charges for theft and abandonment of marriage vows. Peter stepped slightly forward, not enough to be threatening, but enough to make his position clear. I don't believe the lady is interested in going anywhere with you. Tyler Foster's attention shifted to Peter for the first time, and his smile grew even more unpleasant. And you are? Peter Adams. This is my ranch, and Miss Clark is my employee. Miss Clark? Tyler laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Is that what she's calling herself now? Well, Mr. Adams, I'm afraid your employee is actually Mrs. Richard Foster, and she's wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of $5,000 from her husband's employer. The amount was staggering, more money than Peter made in 2 good years. But he kept his expression neutral, refusing to give Tyler the satisfaction of seeing his shock. That's a serious accusation, Peter said carefully. Do you have a warrant? Tyler's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun, a casual gesture that was nonetheless clearly a threat. I have the authority to bring in fugitives from justice. That's all the warrant I need. Actually, said a new voice from behind them, that's not quite accurate. All 3 of them turned to see Joshua Roberts riding into the yard, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something much more serious. Behind him rode Kevin Parker and Larry Wright, both armed and looking grimmer than Peter had ever seen them. Tyler Foster's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw it. 3 against 1 were poor odds, even for a man with a badge. Preacher, Tyler said, his voice carefully neutral. This doesn't concern you? I'm afraid it does, Joshua replied, dismounting with calm efficiency. You see, I've been doing some checking since Amy Hill told me about your visit. Very interesting what you can learn when you send a few telegrams to the right people. Tyler's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I've discovered that Deputy Marshal Tyler Foster died in a shootout in Kansas 3 months ago, Joshua said quietly. I've also discovered that Richard Foster is very much alive and currently in jail in Ohio, awaiting trial for embezzlement. And most interesting of all, I've discovered that there's a substantial reward for the capture of one Thomas Mitchell, who's been impersonating law enforcement officers across 3 territories. The silence that followed was so complete that Peter could hear his own heartbeat. Jacqueline's hand found his arm, her fingers gripping tight enough to leave marks. Thomas Mitchell, the man who had been calling himself Tyler Foster, looked around the circle of hostile faces and seemed to realize that his game was up. His hand moved toward his gun, but Kevin and Larry were already drawing theirs. I wouldn't, Kevin said conversationally. We're all pretty good shots out here, and you're outnumbered. For a moment, Mitchell looked like he might try to shoot his way out anyway. Then his shoulders sagged, and he slowly raised his hands. How did you know? He asked Joshua. The real Tyler Foster was a friend of mine, Joshua replied. We served together during the war. I knew something was wrong the moment Amy described you, but I wanted to be sure before I made any accusations. Peter felt Jacqueline's grip on his arm loosen slightly, though she was still trembling. What does this mean? She whispered. It means, Joshua said gently, that you're not a fugitive, Mrs. Foster. Your husband confessed to everything when he was arrested. He admitted that you had nothing to do with the embezzlement and that you only took the money he had hidden in your house. Mr. Whitmore has been looking for you, not to press charges, but to thank you for returning his property." Jacqueline's legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Peter hadn't caught her. He held her against his chest, feeling her body shake with relief and exhaustion and the aftermath of months of fear. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." But even as he spoke the words, Peter realized that in some ways, it was just the beginning. Jacqueline was free now, free to go anywhere she wanted, to return to civilization and the life she had left behind. She no longer needed his protection or his isolated ranch. The thought of losing her now, just when he had found her, was almost unbearable. Kevin and Larry took charge of Mitchell, binding his hands and preparing to escort him to town where he could be held for the proper authorities. Joshua lingered, his kind eyes moving between Peter and Jacqueline with obvious understanding. "Mrs. Foster," he said gently, "there's something else you should know. Mr. Whitmore has been looking for you for another reason as well. It seems your husband had been forging your signature on various documents, including the deed to some property that belonged to your family. When everything comes to light, you're likely to find yourself a woman of some means." Jacqueline looked up at him with dazed eyes. "I don't understand." "Your husband stole more than just money, ma'am. He stole your inheritance, your identity, your freedom. But now that the truth is known, all of that can be restored to you." After the others had left, taking Mitchell with them to face justice, Peter and Jacqueline found themselves alone in the kitchen, where so much of their relationship had developed. The silence between them was different now, charged with possibilities and uncertainties that neither knew how to address. "So," Peter said finally, "you're free." "Yes." Jacqueline's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm free. You could go anywhere now, back east, to California, anywhere you want." She was quiet for so long that Peter began to prepare himself for the inevitable goodbye. Of course she would leave. Why would a woman with her talents and her newly restored fortune want to stay on an isolated ranch with a man who had forgotten how to live until she taught him? "Peter," she said finally, "do you remember what you said to me that first night I played your wife's guitar?" "I said music was meant to be shared." "Yes, and I've been thinking about that ever since, about what it means to share something precious with someone who understands its value." She turned to face him fully, and Peter saw something in her eyes that made his heart start beating faster. "I've been free before," she continued, "free to make my own choices, to go where I wanted, to be who I wanted to be. But I've never been free to love someone who loved me back. Someone who saw me for who I really am and didn't want to change me or use me or break me down." Peter felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Jacqueline, I know we haven't talked about love," she said quickly. "I know this started as just a business arrangement, and maybe that's all it is for you. But for me, it became something more. You became something more." Peter crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and took her face in his hands, marveling at the way she leaned into his touch instead of flinching away from it. "It became something more for me too," he said. "I just didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if I had the right to ask you to stay, when staying might mean giving up a better life somewhere else." "Peter Adams," Jacqueline said, her voice warm with laughter and tears, "don't you know by now that this is my better life? Here with you, making music in your kitchen and watching the sunrise over your mountains, and knowing that when you look at me, you see someone worth protecting, worth cherishing, worth loving." He kissed her then, soft and careful at first, then with growing passion as she responded with an eagerness that told him everything he needed to know about her feelings. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard and smiling through their tears. "Does this mean you'll stay?" he asked. "Try to make me leave," she replied. And then she was laughing and crying at the same time, and Peter was holding her like he never intended to let her go. That evening, they sat together in the kitchen while Jacqueline played Sarah's guitar and sang the songs that had sustained her through the darkest times of her life. But now the melodies sounded different, infused with joy and hope, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from finding home in another person's heart. Outside, the Montana winter continued its relentless grip on the land. But inside the kitchen of the Broken Arrow Ranch, spring had already arrived. It lived in the sound of Jacqueline's laughter, in the way Peter's eyes crinkled when he smiled, in the comfortable silence that fell between them when words weren't necessary. They talked late into the night, making plans for their future together. Jacqueline would write to Mr. Whitmore, formally returning the money she had taken and accepting whatever inheritance was rightfully hers. Peter would expand the ranch, maybe hire more hands, maybe even build a bigger house with a proper music room where Jacqueline could play to her heart's content. But mostly, they would build a life together, one day at a time, one song at a time, one shared meal at a time. They would create something beautiful out of the broken pieces of their past, something that honored what they had lost while embracing what they had found. As the fire burned low in the stove and the candles flickered in their holders, Jacqueline set aside the guitar and moved to stand beside Peter's chair. He pulled her down onto his lap, and she curled against him with the trust of someone who had finally found a safe harbor. "Peter," she said softly, "will you tell me about Sarah? I'd like to know about the woman who owned this guitar, who made music in this kitchen before I did." And so Peter told her about his first wife, about their brief, bright happiness and the grief that had nearly destroyed him. He told her about the son who had lived for such a short time, but had filled their lives with such joy. He told her about the years of isolation and despair, and how Jacqueline's music had called him back from the edge of a darkness he might never have escaped. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "Sarah always said that music was the language of the soul, and that anyone who could make beautiful music must have a beautiful soul." "I hope I can live up to that," Jacqueline replied. "I hope I can be worthy of the love you shared with her, and the love you're offering me now." "You already are," Peter assured her. "You brought music back into this house, back into my life. You taught me that it's possible to love again without dishonoring what came before." They were married in the spring, when the wildflowers bloomed across the meadows and the mountains shed their winter coats of snow. Joshua Roberts performed the ceremony in the kitchen where they had fallen in love, with Kevin Parker and Larry Wright standing as witnesses and Amy Hill providing a wedding cake that was the talk of the territory for months afterward. Jacqueline wore her blue dress, the one that brought out the color in her eyes, and Peter wore his best suit with the wool socks she had knitted him that Christmas Eve. She carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers she had been arranging in mason jars since her first week at the ranch, and when she walked down the makeshift aisle between the kitchen table and the stove, Peter thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to love and protect and cherish each other through whatever trials might come. When Joshua pronounced them husband and wife, Peter kissed his bride with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them for months, and Jacqueline kissed him back with the joy of a woman who had finally found her home. After the guests had gone and the dishes were washed and put away, Peter and Jacqueline sat together on the front porch of their house, watching the stars come out over the mountains. She had Sarah's guitar in her lap, and she was playing softly, a melody that seemed to capture all the hope and happiness of their wedding day. "What's that song?" Peter asked. "Something new," Jacqueline replied. "I've been working on it for weeks, trying to find the right words to go with the melody. It's about finding love when you least expect it, about the way music can heal a broken heart and bring two people together. Will you sing it for me?" She smiled and began to sing, her voice rising clear and sweet in the mountain air. The song told their story, from the day she arrived at his door to this moment of perfect happiness, and Peter listened with tears in his eyes and love overflowing in his heart. When the last note faded into the silence of the Montana night, Peter took his wife's hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For answering my advertisement, for coming here when you needed a place to heal, for bringing music back into my life, for teaching me that love doesn't end. It just grows and changes and finds new ways to express itself." Jacqueline set the guitar aside and moved closer to him on the porch swing, resting her head on his shoulder with a sigh of deep contentment. "Thank you for giving me a home," she said, "for seeing past my fear and my shame to the person I really am, for loving me not in spite of my scars, but because of the strength they represent." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and feeling the deep satisfaction of two people who had found their place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new songs to be written and sung. But tonight, They had everything they needed, each other, their love, and the promise of a future filled with music and laughter and the kind of happiness that comes from building something beautiful together. In the kitchen behind them, Sarah's guitar waited patiently for the next song, ready to give voice to whatever melodies Jacqueline's heart might create. And in the years to come, that kitchen would be filled with music again, with the sound of children's laughter and family gatherings, and all the small, precious moments that make a house into a home. But it all began with a woman who needed work and a man who needed healing, and the songs that brought them together when they thought they had nothing left to give. It began with the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken places, and that love, like a well-played melody, has the power to transform even the most wounded heart into something capable of joy. The isolated rancher had needed a cook, nothing more. But what he found was a partner, a companion, a love that would sustain them both through all the seasons of their lives together. And every morning, as Jacqueline sang while making his breakfast, Peter Adams would remember the day his world cracked open like a shattered coffee cup, and thank whatever force had brought them together in that kitchen filled with music and hope.